And there's a link on that website that has a video of him explaining in very simple terms what's collapsing.
Kevin, do you want to sit up here somewhere? And I think what we'll do is I'll be the MC, and then can we get everybody to stand up here at the beginning, and then I'll have you guys sit down, and then I'll call you.
Do you guys want us to use the mic or no?
The mic.
Use the
You
mic.
want to use the mic? Okay.
Use the mic.
Because he's recording.
Oh, okay. Is everybody here cool with being recorded? Yeah? Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming out tonight to Quimby's Bookstore. We're really excited about knowing which stories are going to be censored in the next year. Censored 2020. We do also have some more events coming up this month. One of them is Saturday night. The book is What About Tomorrow? An Oral History of Russian Punk by Alexander Hebert or Herbert. I guess it depends if he is pronouncing his name like he's French or not. He will be here on Saturday. And then next Tuesday, the 22nd, we have Zine Club. And there's more about both of those events on our website at quimbys.com. We also send out a monthly newsletter. If you want to be on our mailing list, you can sign up at quimbys.com, or there's a legal pad over near the door. We promise we won't spam you. We just send out a monthly email about events and new stuff and announcements coming up. So thanks for coming out. The book Censored 2020 is available for purchase up at the front. Your MC for this evening is standing right next to me on my right, your left, Steve Macek. Did I say your name right at all? Did
Macek.
I? Macek.
That's okay. I'm going to butcher some names up here in a second. So.
All right, excellent. Well, I guess I will just hand it over to Steve Macek.
Thank you
all right,
so much,
very good.
Liz.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you all for coming out to this first ever Midwestern book launch event for a Project Censored yearbook. For years, they've had book launch events at City Lights in San Francisco because the two main editors of the Project Censored yearbook, Andy Lee Roth and Mickey Huff, are based out in the Bay Area. But this is the first time we've ever had an event in the Midwest or outside the Bay Area. My association with the book is I edited and introduced the Media Democracy in Action chapter of the book, which is a perennial chapter. It's always included in the book. But I also am a faculty evaluator who has worked with students who have contributed to the book. And I'm going to ask the two students whose work appears in the book to step forward. And actually, Kevin, if you could also step up so we can get everybody up here at once. And I'm going to quickly introduce everyone. So I'm going to start all the way on my right, your left, is Jadine Samyetz. All right, I got it right. Who is a student at North Central College who is majoring in interactive media studies with a minor in film and screen studies. She researched one of the stories that made it into the top 10 of the most censored stories of the year of 2018 to 2019. Then next to me is Jem Adamir. He is a double major in communication and philosophy at North Central College. He researched the story that was was a student researcher on the story that was number 2 on the top 25 list for 2018-2019. And finally, on my left, your right, is an actual journalist who has reported one of the stories that made it onto the list, Kevin Gostola, who is managing editor at Shadowproof. Before that, he was a blogger for many years at Fire Lake Dog. I know I used to read his work there. He also has a podcast called Unauthorized.
disclosure?
Unauthorized
Your
disclosure. This is the second time, I believe, one of his stories has made it onto a Project Censored top 25. And he's probably best known, though, for his peerless reporting on the court-martial of Chelsea Manning. He was really, in some ways, the only journalist who was there throughout the entire trial, reporting on it. And some of his reporting has been collected into a co-authored book called Truth and Consequences, the U.S. versus Bradley Manning. So we're going to start with I'm going to speak first. I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction to Project Censored and to this year's book. Then I'll call Jim up to talk about the story that he researched. Then I'll have Jay Dean come up and speak, and then last I'll have Kevin speak. And then finally, I will say just a few words about the Media, Democracy, and Action chapter. So that's the plan. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. Okay, so let me just see a show of hands. How many of you have ever heard of Project Censored or the annual Censored yearbooks? Let me see a show of hands. So, quite a few. Okay, everybody's heard of it before. So maybe I'll keep this introduction really short. Project Censored is a long-running media monitoring and media literacy project that began back in 1976. Was started at Sonoma State University out in California. By a journalism and communication and sociology professor by the name of Carl Jensen. He had been a longtime reporter, newspaperman, who then transitioned into academia. And it started as a course that he taught every year at Sonoma State on media censorship. And he asked his students to look at stories that were being reported in the alternative and independent press that were not being covered regularly by the mainstream corporate media. And every year they would compile a list of the stories that they thought were the most important stories being overlooked or underreported, right? Not being given the attention that they were due in the mainstream media. They would write that up as a press release and send it out to newspapers and news organizations in an effort to get these deserving stories more attention. Eventually, he decided to add kind of another layer of vetting to this process by assembling a group of sort of celebrity judges. He recruited somebody who worked as a press secretary for Betty Ford. He recruited Nicholas Johnson, who had been an FCC commissioner, to be one of the regular judges, and then a number of academics who taught journalism or media studies to judge the stories that the students had researched and to determine whether the relative importance. Kind of fast forward to 1993, he had been doing, by that point he'd been doing this for a good 20 years. And in 1993, they started publishing an annual book, the Censored book. So the first Censored book was Censored 1993, that included summaries of the top 25 most censored stories of the year, stories that were deserving of attention, that hadn't been received the attention they deserved. As well as a chapter that they carried every year called Junk Food News. And this was a chapter that looked at what stories were covered by the corporate media and compared those stories to other important stories that were being overlooked. This year's Junk Food News chapter, let me tell you, in the book is priceless. And I will maybe mention a few things about it in a second. And then it also included a chapter devoted to Media, Democracy, and Action, which was a chapter designed to spotlight alternative news organizations, activists who were fighting against censorship and for freedom of expression, and others that were involved in the effort to make our media more democratic and more responsive to the public and just to better serve democracy. And he would solicit input from these activist groups. They would write little short essays and collect them together. And then they would have oftentimes academics who study journalism and the media write essays of media criticism. So this year's book includes all of those elements. The central chapter of the book is the top 25, and in a second I will run down the this year's top 10 stories. But there's also a junk food news chapter. There's a chapter on what the project calls news abuse. There's a great chapter about censorship of journalists in Kashmir. There's a chapter devoted to the corporate news media's failure to really cover the Trump administration's attack on the LGBTQ community, as well as a number of other really, I think, interesting contributions. Since I've got some students here, I want to say just a little bit about how students participate in the work of Project Censored. So currently, so in the beginning, the students who worked on Project Censored were all students at Sonoma State University. But for the past 20 years, Project Censored has been run by a nonprofit called the Media Freedom Foundation, and they partner with up to about 24 different schools around the country, and in some cases they've also partnered with colleges and universities up in Canada, and in one case I know of in Spain. And the students often, as part of a class, will go about the process of researching overlooked stories. They have to find a story that they think is deserving. They have to check whether that story has gotten coverage in the mainstream media. So they have to do a bit of research to see, in fact, whether it is overlooked or underreported. Then they write up a summary, which is of course evaluated by the faculty member at the university, and then after it gets it goes through that evaluation and vetting process, it gets submitted to Project Censored, which vets it one more time, makes sure that it's an accurate summary of the source material, and then it's placed on a ballot. If it passes those two levels of vetting, it gets placed on a ballot, and sometime in mid-April, that ballot is sent out to everybody involved, to all of the Project Censored's panel of judges, Project Censored staff, all of the faculty who've worked with students on censored stories, and all of the students who've worked on the stories, and everybody votes on the stories. This year there were over 130 stories on the ballot. And only 25 of those stories are chosen to be included in the top 25 list. And then the judges are the ones who then rank the stories. So once the final 25 are chosen, then the celebrity judges, the experts, are the ones who rank the stories. And I'm happy to say this year that 3 students from North Central's stories made it into the top 10. All right, getting on to the top 10. This year's top 10, and the book contains all 25 of the stories identified by Project Censored as undercovered. This year's top 10 is as follows. The number 1 story is the Justice Department using secret FISA rules to target journalists for government surveillance. Really explosive story. The number 2 story of the year is think tank partnerships establishing Facebook as a tool of U.S. foreign policy, and I will say that Jem Adamir, one of my students, was responsible for researching and summarizing this story. Number 3 is indigenous groups in the Amazon propose the creation of the largest wildlife sanctuary on Earth. Number 4, U.S. gas and oil industry posed to release 120 billion tons of new carbon emissions between 2018 and 2050, a very important and topical story. Number 5, an estimated 403,000 people in the U.S. are living in conditions of modern slavery, really an explosive story. And number 6, a story that Jay Dean researched, is survivors of sexual abuse and sex trafficking criminalized for self-defense. Number 7, flawed investigation of sexual assaults in children's immigrant shelters. Number 8, U.S. women risk prison sentences for miscarriages under new abortion regulations. And this story was also researched by a North Central college student, Abby Erler, who has since graduated. She was a broadcast major. Number 9, developing countries' medical needs unfulfilled by big pharma. This is a really interesting story about how drugs that are needed in developing countries are not being developed fast enough, and something like 2/3 of the drugs identified by the medical community needed in developing countries are not being currently developed by big pharmaceutical companies. And number 10, the Pentagon aims to survey social media in order to predict domestic protests, and that one is also very interesting. So if you want to know about all 25 of the stories, you have to purchase the book, which I understand is for sale at the very front of the store. But to tell us a little bit more about story number 2, Jem is going to come up and talk about the story that he researched. All right.
Hello. So I'd like to start before going on to my story by first thanking Quimby's for hosting us. I really do appreciate it. And being a part of Project Censored, I'm really excited to be here. I want to start off with the cover. The cover is pretty fascinating. We're lucky to have such a fascinating cover. The cover has Alice looking into the looking glass. And in the looking glass, we can see the Cheshire Cat with Donald Trump's face. We see the White House in the background with a money symbol on it. So clearly, there's like an emphasis being made here that is introduced in Project Censored's 2020 edition with the concept of, and I'm going to quote here, if you choose to let Facebook, Google, the media, or the government curate your information, if you trust them to do so, that's your choice. But it should just be a choice, not a government mandate. And one of the interesting things here that's being brought up by Project Censored is the idea of what journalism is that is exemplified through this cover, and it is seen throughout, because the cover focuses on how journalists will come with their own interpretation. We often see journalism as just a media that, or a mirror that we look into, but that mirror is distorted, similar to what Alice experiences in Alice in Wonderland. And I think that's a really fascinating approach that Project Censored has taken with this year's cover that actually works exactly with my story that I did research. Because I'm guessing everybody here has used Facebook and knows of Facebook. It's the most common and widely accessed social media platform. What's interesting is, just like the looking glass, Facebook is able to control exactly what we view and what is put out there through our media. It's very similar to Alice in Wonderland because it's a distorted perspective. And so my story originally was called Facebook Joins Government Surrogates to Fight Propaganda, and it still upholds as such because there are different types of surrogates that are at play that Facebook has partnered with. And I want to go over a couple in my story. So first, very fascinating, the Atlantic Council, which is a Washington D.C. based think tank that is actually partnered up with Facebook. This is very dangerous. Let me tell you a couple of reasons why. This think tank funds and is funded by large oil companies, also funded by the U.S. military too, and furthermore, NATO is also a part of it. You can have prominent members. Interestingly enough, we have the Turkish leader in charge, President Erdogan, who is in the media right now for his attack in Syria, also part of the largest donators that this company actually brought up on a pedestal, who congratulated him for donating to this Washington think tank. And furthermore, they even gave out a distinguished award to George W. Bush for his distinct leadership, which is interesting that Facebook is taking their advice and also funding from this Washington-based think tank that's been up to clearly some unethical past history. So ultimately, this actually wasn't it. Facebook didn't just partner up with this Washington-based Atlantic Council. They also partnered up with the National Endowment of Democracy. And if anybody here knows of the National Endowment of Democracy, it's fascinating. In the 1980s, the U.S. created a system at play that they would be able to spread democracy to third world countries around the world. And their intent here was to establish democracy everywhere and use propaganda to control said democracy. And so the NED is split into two separate organizations, the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute. They are supposed to be nonpartisan, but both are led by their so the International Republican Institute is led by a Republican senator, and furthermore, both of them are led by their own partisan views, I would argue, because though they're supposed to be nonpartisan, we've seen them clearly affect different countries in Southern America and their election cycles. So here's a couple of examples here. The NDI, in the past, had actually destabilized the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, which was clearly an effective tool of U.S. paternalism on another country and their election cycle. And furthermore, the IRI in actually 2002 supported the coup attempt against the Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. And so clearly we have these other partisan forces that have influenced left election cycles in other countries that Facebook has decided to partner up with. And this is pretty dangerous, and here's my final point on exactly what has Facebook done. Since partying up with them, what have they been up to? Well, interestingly enough, Facebook decided that they would actually take down a couple websites that were linked to them that were actually part of the election cycle. So a couple websites being that of the Telesur and also Venezuelan Analysis were shut down by Facebook on their website. And these were important to the election cycle because it was reported that over 52% of Brazilians get their Facebook or their news from Facebook. A lot of countries get their news from Facebook, and if you've got an over majority population getting their information, the majority of their information off of Facebook, and then Facebook cherry picks which sites are going to be on their website, it clearly leads to fraudulent, and it's not fair to other countries, and ultimately perpetuates this American paternalism in a way that we haven't ever seen it before. Now we're seeing technology being used on not only us, but also being used by us on other countries. Now, when this story was really initially talked about, a couple months beforehand, the government had questioned Mark Zuckerberg, and so Facebook reported this issue not in this lens of them censoring other countries. So though this issue was semi-reported by bigger organizations, it was really just focused on what the NRI is and the IRI, but it was never what Facebook actually does. And Facebook, and what they do is not showing specific platforms and not showing specific issues that they want to influence an election cycle. Ultimately showing that it's significant to recognize that Facebook is still actively trying to influence other countries and that we should recognize it. So I'm really happy to be able to work with this story because these think tanks will influence Facebook and they're going to continue their propaganda. Thank you.
Next, Jadine is going to come up and talk about the story that she researched.
Perfect. It's my height, nobody else's. Yeah. So for Project Censored, it was really. Oh, thank you.
Right up on there.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, for Project Censored, it was actually pretty fun to do research for. It was really interesting because I'm not really. Surprisingly enough, I'm not really a news person, so I feel like this kind of delved me into that. Yes, now I'm louder. So, yeah, but anyways, so my story is number 6, and it focuses mostly on Cyntoia Brown, which I feel like most people here would know about her, yeah. That happened way back in 2004. She was only 16 at the time. She was sex trafficked, but she identified as a teenage prostitute, not realizing that she's being taken advantage of, and she actually killed one of her rapists out of self-defense, and the court that tried her, instead of trying her as a 16-year-old girl, tried her as an adult, and she ended up having a sentence to life in prison, which is absolutely crazy for a 16-year-old girl. When this first happened, nobody was talking about it. I think the most traction it got was from Reddit, so, and I mean, I would know about that, but most people, I don't think most people are going on Reddit for their news. So it wasn't until like 13 years later in 2017 that there was this Twitter hashtag trending, Free Cyntoia Brown, that was endorsed by celebrities at the time. So Kim Kardashian, Rihanna, Snoop Dogg, LeBron James, like all these celebrities were tweeting about her, and it took a Twitter trend for us to actually start paying attention to Cyntoia's case. And within 2 years, so in 2019, she was granted clemency, a big deal, and so this is when corporate media actually started picking up the news and the story itself. But the difference is that corporate media, such as like CNN and Fox News, had a different focus than Twitter did at the time, because Twitter was saying, this is injustice, this isn't right, that a 16-year-old girl is being tried like this. And then we had CNN talking about the UN 2019 report of sexual exploitation at the time, and saying that it was mostly just like a global issue. And that's definitely a strategic way to disconnect us readers from identifying sexual exploitation and human trafficking in the US, because then we start thinking that it's just happening everywhere else, and this is just like one granted case. And then we also had Fox News that was focusing on Trump's angle that human trafficking was connected to U.S. illegal immigration at the time, and that's the angle that we took with it in Cyntoia's case, instead of like actually paying attention to how the system treats these women who are taken advantage of, and how they're the ones who are punished for their abusers' decisions. So that's often like what happened. And then 3 days ago, actually, which is really convenient for me, but Cyntoia Brown had an interview with NBC News, and in this interview she started talking about how there are thousands of Cyntoia Browns out there. It's not just her, and that's mostly the main focus of my chapter that I wrote, because Cyntoia Brown like had a lot of help within the system from women like her who are sentenced to ridiculous lives in prison, and they helped her get out, but there are so many other women like her that have absolutely no attention, no help, and no endorsement. They don't get a Twitter hashtag like Free Cyntoia Brown. And corporate media decides not to focus on this because we have Cyntoia, and that's our like token lady who made it out, so now it really doesn't matter. Yeah, so that's like a huge thing that's going on right now. And in Democracy Now!, Miriam Kaba, who is a co-founder for Survivors and Punishment, she talks about how like there are like 71 to 95% women who are incarcerated who have been abused by their intimate partners, and she talks about how this is more of like an abuse to prison pipeline that happens, because Cyntoia Brown's like not the only case like this. There's a ton of other women like this, including Susan Burton, who's an incarcerated survivor, and she talks about how the system often does like incarcerated trauma through this case, because you have victims of sexual abuse who are protecting themselves, and instead of those abusers being punished, it's the women instead. So yeah, it's been cool to have like Project Censored pay attention to this, and thank you for being here.
Next, Kevin.
All right, so I'm glad to be here for Project Censored, and I guess I'm representing what a journalist really is and what a journalist should be doing for Project Censored. So, as was said, I am referenced in the second story that's about the think tanks. In fact, I have a partner who I have as a co-host for my show Unauthorized Disclosure, and she herself has been targeted. She lives in Beirut, Lebanon, and she works for, and I understand that in this time of panic around Russia and with the Russiagate investigation, it's very difficult for people who are living in the United States to accept this, but she works for a state-funded media project that openly, transparently is funded by the Russian government. And part of how she ended up at this outlet working as a journalist is because she was targeted for dissenting against the policy that we had in Syria, for arming certain groups that are unsavory, that are the same types of fighters who rose to prominence in Afghanistan and gave us problems like 9/11 and other things like that, the sort of blowback that we've been dealing with for decades now. She was pointing out that we're giving weapons to groups in Syria that we're not going to want to have power in the country when we finally leave. And for doing that, she was seen as being on the side of Bashar al-Assad, and there were people who demonized her in the corporate press, they still do. And so essentially she was forced out of her work, and the only place she could go to get a salary is at a state-funded media project. And they're open about it, so if you don't like what they're saying, you can make that own judgment. You can make that judgment yourself. You don't have to shut it down. And so there should be more speech, not less speech, I think, in general in a democracy. We can make our own decisions. But CNN didn't like that. But CNN is living in an economy right now, a media environment that demands, is hungry for these stories about Russia and how Russia is invading our elections or destroying our democracy. You know, it's not us. We're not the ones who are undermining. We are led to believe that the reason Donald Trump was elected is not something that is going wrong inside our country. We have people within our establishment that want to say it's something that an outside country did to us so that we don't have to take responsibility and engage in self-reflection about why Hillary Clinton lost and Donald Trump became president instead. And so what ends up happening is what is referenced in this story, this number 2 story, that you had CNN looking for anything they could find that could keep this going about Russia. And they found that this company, this project, Macek Media, existed. And so they sent people out to dig for dirt. And they wanted to know, maybe this company has problems with workplace retaliation, or maybe they're not paying their contractors appropriately. Maybe they are forcing people to cover stories they don't want to do. Actually, in fact, they gave Rania, my colleague, an opportunity to go cover a very important story in Alabama about poverty, like how people are living in these like sewage. There's just dumps of sewage that aren't being cleaned up. This ended up being covered in a UN report on poverty. So she's able to talk to people about this story. And they got to this documentary filmmaker who worked on the project, this camera person who worked as a contractor on it. They're asking her, harassing her, saying, what can you tell us about Rania? And this gets back to the company, and they find out that they're going around trying to dig up dirt. And so the company says, hey, we'll open up our books. You can talk to our people. This is who runs Macek Media. You can talk to anyone here. You are welcome to see. This is who funds us. We'll tell you, 51% comes from the Russian government, and then the rest comes from this other person, Anissa Nawe, who is involved in running. You can talk to her, you can talk to Rania, and you can talk to the COO. His name's J. Ray Sparks. So they talk. This guy, Drew Griffin, does this interview, and it's about 40 minutes long, and they collect all of this information. They talk. Rania is very open. J. Ray is very open, talking about how they cover Venezuela and all of this. And Drew is pressuring Rania throughout this interview. Why do you believe that, one of the lines was, the line that you have about Venezuela sounds a lot like what's coming out of the Kremlin. And she says, well, I have a problem because I think that what we're doing through Donald Trump's administration with this government that we have is backing a group of people in Venezuela that is being used to destabilize that government. So, I have a problem, and, your people are on the ground reporting, and I don't know why you're not reporting on what Donald Trump is doing in Venezuela. But somehow that gets interpreted as she must be getting these ideas from the Russian government. And so anyways, they didn't find what they were looking for. They did not find any evidence that this project was shadowy and trying to hide its operations. And so instead what they did is they contacted Facebook and they said, hey, there's a problem here. This project does not display on its page that it's being funded by the Russian government. And isn't that a problem? Well, actually, no, because Facebook didn't have a policy that said that state-sponsored media had to say so. And in fact, if you go to those pages, there's nothing that says that you have to show, if you're a news media outlet, where you're getting your funding. None of you could tell me who's funding CNN. And I don't know. There's probably a lot of different people. I mean, they're advertisers. We could all watch their commercials for a few days and try to figure that out. But they don't say on their page who's funding CNN, Fox News, News Corps. We don't know who's funding. I mean, they're a profitable company and they're getting money from people, but we don't know. So the Facebook said, well, I guess we have a problem. So you're going to put the story out. It's going to make us look badly. So we probably should take down these pages, and then they can't use them anymore. And so they take them down, and then now CNN had their story. They didn't have a scoop at all until this happened. And now they ran with the story of Facebook has shut down these pages, and it's this media project that was set up, and it's undermining our democracy. And then if you read this headline, everyone who's already been primed to fear starts getting wound up and says, well, these are people who are responsible for Donald Trump, and they're taking down this country, and everyone just is going crazy about it. So ultimately they won. They got the pages back and restored, but this is just a good example of the sort of like panic that has ensued in our country, and also how a lot of people who are journalists are really susceptible to this. I mean, we had a prime example with Lawrence O'Donnell going on MSNBC and having to retract a story about how Donald Trump was tied to Russian oligarchs through Deutsche Bank. And he said, I have the quote here, "Last night on this show, I discussed information that wasn't ready for reporting, noting that his reporting relied on a single source and did not," he said, quote, "go through the rigorous verification and standards process here at MSNBC." All I can say is, if this is what journalists are doing, fishing around trying to engineer stories about Russian interference, if they're going around making up stories about Donald Trump, you're actually doing the thing that Donald Trump says about you. You are making fake news. You are playing right into Donald Trump, and you are making him more of a figure that can ruin our democracy even further than he already has. So I think this is a really important story about what Facebook, what these social media institutions are doing. They have appointed themselves because my last point here is that you see from people, whether it's Admiral McRaven, who was in charge of special operations, whether it's former CIA director John Brennan, whether it's any of these figures who have lost their place in power, they wish they could still be in the circle. They're upset that Hillary Clinton didn't win, and you have a lot of figures who used to be in these security agencies that are trying to maintain some connection to the United States government and have influence, and they know that Donald Trump doesn't want to have anything to do with them. But then what happens as a result of this is they are asking Facebook, they're asking these think tanks to get involved in controlling our discourse around issues. And they're narrowing the sort of debates that we can have, particularly around foreign policy, and they're telling certain parts of the country who they can and can't support when it comes to democracy movements or protest movements that are in different countries. And if those protest movements don't align with the United States government and their own foreign policy, then what you find is, time and time again, that on Facebook or Twitter, those pages are being shut down, or you're having entire accounts that are removed, and you have individuals who have to fight to get themselves restored so that they can participate in these conversations about what's happening in current events. So that's basically how I come to this. And then the last quick point I'll make is that a lot of my stuff had been in a prior book. I was mentioned for covering the Chelsea Manning case, covering the trial there. And again, that's something that's really crucial, because we still don't have a media that really understands how to cover whistleblowers. And I think that maybe wasn't borne out exactly because they're really sympathetic to the Ukraine call whistleblower, but the fact is that we still don't really have a press that wants people to come forward. If somebody's in the Trump administration who wants to blow the whistle right now, the first question they're going to ask is, did you go through proper channels? And if you didn't go through proper channels, then the whole time that they're listening to what you have to say about what Donald Trump is doing that is incredibly corrupt, they're going to be judging you about whether you broke the law. And we're not even going to talk about the thing that he did that was illegal, that was abusive, that was wasteful or fraudulent. We're going to spend a whole time trying to kill you as the messenger and judge you for having the courage to come forward. And that's basically where we're at right now, is we still have a press that does not fully appreciate the whistleblowers that are willing to take risks and come forward and say what they have to say.
Thank you so much. Now, I guess I just want to add one more thing about this, that story number 2 and the story you reported is, I believe that CNN consulted some employee of the Atlantic Council in their original story. So they were actually consulting this State Department, U.S. military funded think tank as a source in this story that was designed to discredit your colleagues. So in any case, I want to just very quickly talk about the chapter that I was directly responsible for in the book, which is the Media Democracy in Action chapter. It's a chapter of the book. It's been published since the beginning, since 1993. They've always included a chapter that spotlights and showcases activist groups who either activist groups or alternative media that are working to get out kind of the whole truth on important stories. And I wanted to talk. So in this year's chapter, there are 6 contributors: Catherine Foxhall of the Society of Professional Journalists, Russ Kick, who is author of a great book called The Disinfopedia, and also is a government transparency activist, runs a website called AltGov2. A couple of colleagues of mine from the Union for Democratic Communications, Matthew Crane and Anthony Nadler, who wrote a report for Data and Society about the digital influence machine, and DeSmog Blog, which is a blog that is devoted to countering and debunking fossil fuel industry propaganda about climate change. Labor Notes, which is the leading independent rank and file, labor-run news outlet, newspaper devoted to labor issues. And then finally, Propaganda Critic, which is a website that provides tools to ordinary citizens and especially to college students about how to analyze propaganda. I just want to talk about 2 of those contributions. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I want to talk about the contribution from Catherine Foxhall of SPJ, Society of Professional Journalists. Her entire entry is about an issue that the society, that SPJ, has been very, very active on for a number of years, namely censorship via Public Information Office. She notes that according to surveys that SPJ has sent out to working journalists all over the country over a course of a number of years, that journalists are increasingly finding that employees at government agencies like the Federal Drug Administration, the CDC, the EPA, and other important institutions are being forbidden to talk to journalists. And they are being instructed, and the employees are being instructed, that when a journalist approaches them, they need to direct that journalist to an office of to a public information officer who will okay whether or not the interview takes place. And in many cases, they deny journalists the rights to interview employees. And secondly, they will insist that the information officer be present during the interview. And what she notes is that, for years, journalists used to walk the halls of government agencies, right? The EPA, the FDA, the Department of Labor, and just sort of chat with people. That was actually a major source of information, or the EPA, that was a major source of information for journalists, right? Just patrolling the halls, walking the halls. And now they're being instructed to get an okay from some central office to even talk to them. And she calls this, censorship really by other means. And she notes that there have been a number of stories that, probably should have been reported before. For example, the problem with water quality in Flint, Michigan, the water in Flint, Michigan being contaminated with lead, that probably should have been caught before, but who knows, right, how many journalists were rebuffed who had initially made, inquiries about the stories. So her piece about this is really fantastic, but I think Russ Kick's piece, even though it is a little bit more technical, I think is in some ways even more important. So Russ Kick, as I said, author of Disinfopedia, he's an investigative journalist. He actually has gotten involved in doing graphic novels recently too. He's involved in editing something called the Graphic Canon, where they publish graphic novel versions of great books, starting with Homer's Odyssey and going all the way through to de Beauvoir's Second Sex. It's kind of an interesting project, but he's somebody who seems to have kind of boundless energy, and he became aware a few years ago of the process by which federal government records are destroyed. And this was, when I read this story, I was just completely blown away. And I insisted that it had to be in the book, even though the story he sent me was like 3,000 words, and I had to have him insisted that he had to cut it down to 1,000 words. So many of us don't know this, but federal government agencies only retain permanently about 3% of the records that they generate, right? That means about 97% of federal government records are at some point destroyed. But there is a process that they have to go through in order to get permission to destroy those records. The National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, is the one who approves requests to destroy government records. And the way that it works is this: there are certain kinds of records where NARA has a sort of a standard schedule where, like, say, something like minutes of meetings or payroll information can be destroyed after a certain period of time, just automatically. But if it is something unique, for example, if it is complaints that people if people have complaints about TSA and the treatment they received as they were going through TSA screening, that's a unique kind of record, and so they have to make a proposal to NARA to destroy those records, right? They have to explain why they don't want to retain those records and when they want to destroy them. They may keep them for a year, they may keep them for a few months, they may say, we want to destroy these tomorrow, right? And they make a proposal, and then NARA is supposed to publish that proposal in the Federal Registry, and then it is supposed to be open to public comment. So the public can weigh in. So if the public decides that complaints that people have made about the Immigration and Customs, about ICE, that they want those records retained, they should have the right to weigh in when ICE is proposing to eliminate those records. So he just on his own stumbled across this, and he started requesting the full proposals for these proposals to destroy government records. And I just want to read part of what he wrote here because I think it's so important. In the first half of 2018, I discovered that the National Security Agency, NSA, proposed to destroy all complaints and inquiries it receives about civil liberties after a retention period of 1 year. Right? This is not something that the news media was reporting on. This is not something that was public knowledge whatsoever. Still, nothing much happened. Not until I got a gigantic request, which he obtained again by making a request to NARA, that the Interior Department had sent to NARA proposing to destroy massive amounts of documents about oil and gas leases, mining, dams, wells, timber sales, fishing, endangered species, critical habitats, land acquisition, and more. I decided to highlight that mega proposal on a separate webpage and informed reporters, open government proponents, and environmental activists. The interest was explosive. Scientists, environmentalists, animal rights activists, and transparency advocates were furious. NARA was flooded with public comments on the proposal. NARA eventually received more than 12,000 comments, thousands more than the agency receives on most proposals. And what's so interesting about this is this one incident, the fact that he highlighted this proposal that trumps EPA or Trump's Department of Interior had made to destroy all of these really critical records. Because of the protest about this, NARA has changed the way it handles these requests. So now they made a big announcement that they would immediately, starting in March of 2019, just a few months ago, that they would immediately begin posting online all schedules for records destruction proposals, create an online system that allow public comments on the proposals, and extend the comment period from just 30 days to 45 days. And NARA themselves credited this sea change to, quote, the clear, widespread interest from the public in the previous obscure, arcane process. So he titles this chapter, How He Changed, right, the process of the destruction of government documents. He makes the point here that the changes that NARA have made are not really even sufficient, that more needs to be done. And he makes the argument that in this digital age, when most of the records being generated by the federal government are not taking up the room that they once did, right? They're not pieces of paper sitting on shelves, they're digital files, they take up very little space, that there's actually no reason for many of these records to be destroyed, right? They can be retained indefinitely and they're not going to take up a lot of space. So he would like to see historians, environmental activists, and others have a seat at the table in discussions and decisions about what government records get destroyed and when. Now, I know it's not a sexy issue. It's not going to become an important issue in the 2020 presidential election, but it's vitally important for our democracy and it's vitally important for government transparency. I could talk on and on about some of the other entries in the Media Democracy in Action chapter. They're fantastic. I think all of the chapters in the book are really strong, very interesting. I really recommend, especially the chapter on Kashmir and what is happening to journalists who are covering the almost completely invisible civil war that is taking place in Kashmir, and what the Indian government is doing to journalists there is just truly appalling. But I think we're almost out of time. So what I'd like to do is kind of throw it open to the few folks who are out here, to any questions that people have for any of the people who spoke, or for me, for Kevin, for Jem, for Jay Dean. Anyone? Questions? Comments? Dale?
Since most of the media, mainstream media, are corporate entities owned by people with a vested interest in retaining the advertising that they make their money off of, can you talk about the market model for filtering the news stories that you've been talking about, filtering or disappearing, just like Gary Webb,
right?
Who got the story out, and it wasn't just he who had to retract it, but all the newspapers went and vilified him for telling the truth about the CIA and drug running.
Well, I bet Kevin might want to comment on that. I guess what I would say is I'm a big believer in Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman's quite famous propaganda model. If you're familiar with that, what Ed Herman and Noam Chomsky argue is that the information we get, the news that we get, is filtered by these structural constraints, that the news media are not really free to report everything that's happened in the world, and to report it truthfully, that they are constrained, first of all, by the fact that most news organizations, the big ones with the large audiences, are corporate owned. They're owned by big multimedia conglomerates, whether it's 21st Century Fox or News Corporation or Time Warner, the New York Times, etc. So they're owned by big companies. They're also subsidized, right, by huge advertisers. So the major advertisers who advertise in corporate media are very large, corporate entities, like the McDonald's and Johnson & Johnson and Procter & Gamble and so on. and that they depend for information, especially on political stories, stories about foreign policy, stories about the military. They depend structurally on sources who are powerful political actors, right? They depend on access to the White House, access to Congress, et cetera, et cetera. And that they're also subject to what they call flack, which is negative feedback from some of these same powerful entities like the Pentagon and so on. And I think if you look at those structural constraints working together, it helps to explain why some of these important stories that are included in the top 25 list get overlooked, right? There's because for the New York Times or CNN, any of them to talk too much about the fact that the fossil fuel companies, with their shale oil drilling, are poised to release 120 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. That's going to be bad for the bottom line of Exxon, which is a heavy advertiser, right? BP and others, and many of these large, fossil fuel companies also have positions on the boards of the major media companies, and so there'll be like a direct conflict. So I think those structural constraints explain a lot about why some of these important stories that are included in the book are not reported more thoroughly. But Kevin, do you want to say anything?
Well, I'll give a quick minute here. I'll run through this quickly, like Anderson Cooper's going to interrupt me and cut me off. I think there's an entertainment component too, because a lot of what the news is doing is packaging these news stories in order to entertain and keep their audiences glued hour after hour after hour. They want eyeballs so that they can guarantee these advertisers keep coming back to them. And obviously, I don't know that any of these stories are particularly entertaining. If anything, they might be a little depressing and perhaps make you more cynical about the world we live in. So it's probably going to pay more for them to blow up Donald Trump's tweet and roast Donald Trump and how and Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone, he argues that in many ways a lot of our entertainment now resembles like a pro wrestling kind of a match, that sort of with the election of Donald Trump, that a lot of our entertainment is now really just heroes and villains of these wrestling matches going back and forth at each other. We're told who to hate. We're told who to like. Each of us pair off into our own silos. We pick our own groups. We sort ourselves out into who we're going to stand with as our crowd, and then that sort of defines the kind of media we get. And a lot of these stories are dense. They involve systemic problems. It's harder to pick out certain individuals to demonize when you talk about, sex abuse, sex trafficking, slavery, the think tanks thing, talking about military, big pharma. None of these have easy answers. There's no easy answers to solving these issues. And that's where the entertainment value, the sort of networks want to give us easy solutions. They only want to talk about things that they feel like we can solve. And that's a product of a lot of what Steve was already talking about.
Any other questions or comments people have? Anyone? Questions, comments? All right, well, thank you all for coming out, and I really do strongly encourage everyone physically present here, anyone who's going to watch the video, to please purchase a copy of Censored 2020, and when you do, buy it here at Quimby's. All right, thank you.